Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Taking the temperature of America and the world in this time of unprecedented crisis. That's what we're doing today here on Liberty Nation Radio. And there's no better man to give us the readings from the thermometer than the managing editor of LibertyNation.com, Mark Angelides, who studies opinion polls, approval numbers, and betting odds with a microscope each and every day. So welcome, Mark, and let's start with approval numbers for the president. Strangely, it seems his numbers have gone down in Rasmussen, where he's always been particularly strong, but up in Gallop and some of the other polls where he's been weaker traditionally. What do you surmise about Americans' view of Donald Trump's performance in the coronavirus crisis?
Well, Tim, it's quite clear that these polls that we're seeing coming out are a reaction to how this is being handled. Obviously, a lot of it's to do with him being on air all the time as well, so people can actually see he's doing something, like it's daily broadcasts. But you mentioned the polls, as you say, Rasmussen, traditionally around 49 to 51% for Donald Trump, which is usually the outlier, although Rasmussen is incredibly well respected. But he's hovering around 46% there. But as you point out, you've got the Gallop poll, you've got the latest, is it the Reuters and Ipsos, the Economist YouGov polls? They're all at 49%. The most interesting aspect of that is where that support's coming from. Because obviously we know that the Republican base is very much behind President Trump, almost no matter what. And that's sticking around 92% support within Republicans. But what you're seeing is independents, especially in the Gallup poll, independents, you've got an 8-point bump. And in Democrats, you've got a 6-point bump, which is huge. That's putting it up to 13% job approval rating for the president from Democrats. Now, if even a small handful of that percent switches sides come the election, which could happen, I'm sure we're going to talk about Joe Biden later. But even if just a small percentage, you're going to see some major swings for Donald Trump.
Do you get the sense, Mark, at this point, that COVID-19 is going to be just about the only issue people will wind up voting on in November, or will all the issues which were front and center before the crisis hit come back to play a big role in the outcome?
At this point, right now, I think it is not so much the COVID reaction, the COVID-19 reaction, but it's more what Trump's doing to protect the economy, which will come back, because it's always about the economy. It always is. But what's happening here is people are looking at how President Trump is handling the economy and what he's doing to kind of bounce it back, especially with his optimism about getting things reopened around Easter, which around 61% of American voters actually think is doable. But what you're going to see is people are looking at how long would this financial disaster continue if it were in the hands of somebody else, for example, Joe Biden.
Okay, so what about Joe Biden? He's done two things essentially during this crisis. He's locked himself away in his home, and he's held some online events which have been awkward, sloppy, rehearsed at best, while calling President Trump's leadership in the crisis a colossal failure. Is it to Biden's advantage to stay hidden and throw the occasional stink bomb at the president, or does he need to be more proactive?
It depends on his goal, Tim. If he wants to become the next president of the United States, he needs to do a lot more. If he wants to limit damage to the actual Democratic Party, then staying hidden away from sight is probably the best thing he can do for them. It's really appearing on a couple of live streams with what many people would describe as a boomer technology. Meaning that he hasn't really got the hang of putting together the video and the sound, or the people he's having doing it for him are just doing an incredibly poor job of this. And so he's losing the young audience straight away just by poor production qualities. And then, of course, his no malarkey happy hour was really just a sycophantic mass gathering to worship at the feet of Biden by party faithfuls. It's not convincing anyone. It's not inspiring anyone. There's very little that he's doing to pose a threat in 2020.
Of course, you could make the argument that all he has to do is not be Donald Trump. And then you have a referendum on Trump set up. But of course, there's the question of his declining neurological health. But let's talk about the betting odds because they certainly have changed and fluctuated during this crisis. Are the numbers here in late March even relevant to what's ultimately going to happen in November?
Not really. They do give an indication, certainly, of where the country's going. And obviously, positivity brings more positivity, negativity brings more negativity. So people are watching these numbers, and they are quite in tune with polling. But at the moment, what you've got is Joe Biden is still the favorite to win the nomination. But that has gone from a very strong position a couple of weeks ago to he's still favorite, but not quite so much. Andrew Cuomo is coming in very, very hot behind here. He's entered the betting marks at 20 to 1. He's not even standing. But I think a lot of people are toying with the idea. How realistic it is, we don't know, but toying with the idea of perhaps handing it over to Cuomo at the Milwaukee convention. But in terms of who's going to win the presidency, based on the betting odds, well, 2 weeks ago, Joe Biden, for the very first time, had a higher chance of winning the presidency than Donald Trump. That's the only time that's happened since Donald Trump was elected. But things have gone back to normal now. And I'm presuming this is because of Donald Trump's good response to the COVID crisis. And obviously Joe Biden, as you mentioned, being locked away in his basement somewhere. And so the odds are now showing Donald Trump back as firm favorite, Joe Biden, not a very close second.
Okay, so the European Union had
Mm.
arguably the toughest fight in all this, except of course China, because of the open borders between their more than 24 countries. So we talk a lot about America's ability to recover from this crisis, Mark, but what about the EU?
Well, I'm glad you asked this, Tim. As you know, this is one of my favorite topics, the EU, and what I've predicted for a long time is the impending doom of the actual EU as an institution. I think this Corona crisis is really just exacerbating the situation. They've completely failed in terms of leadership. I'll just give you a couple of examples, if I may. Italy, arguably the hardest hit in Europe by this crisis, decided that it would put some of the government money into hotels in Sardinia, which is a part of Italy, to try and just keep them there so they're not going to go under during this crisis and can come back afterwards. Very similar to what this new relief package is doing, is providing money to keep people afloat. But because the European Union has what we call state aid rules, which means that because it's anti-competitive for other EU nations to put government money into private industry, they've charged Italy $8.5 million. And now Italy, obviously, they don't have that money to splash out and pay these fines. So now every single day they're being fined extra for not paying. This is not the solidarity that the EU billed itself as. And of course, as the crisis gets worse, each country is essentially, they're closing their borders. They're refusing to send personal protective equipment, PPE stuff, that have been ordered and paid for in good faith from other European neighbors, because they're saying they want to keep them for themselves. This is Germany in particular, not sending the order that Italy made of all these N95 masks. And of course, you've got France blocking a truck of N95 masks that was on its way to Britain, to the hospitals in Britain, where they're very much needed. And the Border Patrol stopped it, and they've impounded all these N95 masks. Essentially, there's no other way to look at this but say they stole them from Britain. It's just shocking. The whole thing's falling apart. It was an edifice that was built on sand, and it's just crumbling now.
Well, and the problem is that, of course, in this global economy, when our trading partners like the EU are suffering, that means the downdraft is substantial for the United States and the rest of the world. Mark, thanks for joining us. I appreciate it.
Pleasure.
Mark Angelides, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, joining us from the UK. Stay there. We'll be back with Talkin' Liberty.